7-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched her younger sister's hands tightly as they skipped down the sun-drenched sidewalk of Maplewood Heights, their laughter echoing through the quiet suburban neighborhood where children played freely and parents never locked their doors. But on that sweltering July afternoon in 2017, 3 innocent girls would vanish without a trace, sparking a nationwide search that would consume investigators, devastate a family, and ultimately lead to a discovery so shocking that it would challenge everything anyone thought they knew about missing person cases. What happened to Emma, 6-year-old Sofia, and 4-year-old Isabella Rodriguez during those crucial 47 minutes when they disappeared from their grandmother's front yard would remain one of the most baffling mysteries in the state's history, until a retired Army Ranger with his own haunting secrets would stumble upon evidence that would turn the entire investigation upside down and reveal a truth so extraordinary that even seasoned detectives would struggle to believe it. The Rodriguez family had always been the heartbeat of Maplewood Heights, a close-knit community nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California, where Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees and the scent of jasmine filled the evening air. Maria Rodriguez, the girl's mother, worked double shifts at the local hospital as a registered nurse, her dedication to healing others matched only by her fierce love for her 3 daughters. Their father, David, had been deployed overseas with the Marines for the past 8 months, leaving Maria to juggle the overwhelming responsibilities of single motherhood while maintaining her demanding career and caring for her aging mother, Carmen, who lived in the small but immaculate house on Elm Street where the girls spent their afternoons. Carmen Rodriguez had immigrated to the United States 43 years earlier, with nothing but a suitcase full of dreams and an unshakable faith in the American promise of opportunity. She had worked tirelessly as a seamstress, her weathered fingers crafting beautiful alterations and repairs that earned her a reputation throughout the community as an artist with needle and thread. Her small house, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim and surrounded by a garden bursting with roses, marigolds, and herbs, had become a sanctuary for her granddaughters, a place where they could run freely in the fenced backyard and help their abuela tend to the vegetables that would become the evening's dinner. Emma, the eldest at 7, possessed an old soul that seemed to carry wisdom beyond her years, her dark eyes sparkling with intelligence and her natural leadership qualities evident in the way she guided her younger sisters through their daily adventures. She excelled in school, reading at a level far advanced for her age, and had recently discovered a passion for astronomy, spending hours gazing through the small telescope her deployed father had sent for her birthday. Her teachers described her as remarkably mature and responsible, traits that had become even more pronounced since her father's deployment, as she stepped into the role of protector and guide for Sofia and Isabella. Sofia, just 6 years old, radiated pure joy wherever she went, her infectious giggle and boundless energy lighting up every room she entered. She loved to dance, twirling around the living room in her favorite pink tutu while humming songs she made up on the spot, her creativity flowing as naturally as breathing. Despite her youth, Sofia displayed an remarkable empathy, always the first to comfort a crying friend or share her toys with children who had none. Her kindergarten teacher often marveled at Sofia's ability to sense when someone needed kindness, describing her as having an almost supernatural ability to bring out the best in others. Isabella, the baby of the family at 4 years old, possessed a quiet strength that belied her small stature, her thoughtful nature and keen observation skills often surprising adults who underestimated her intelligence. She rarely spoke unless she had something important to say, but when she did speak, her words carried weight and wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. Isabella had a special bond with animals, able to calm frightened dogs and coax shy cats from their hiding places with a gentleness that seemed almost magical. Her preschool teachers noted that other children naturally gravitated toward Isabella during difficult moments, as if sensing her innate ability to provide comfort and stability. The 3 sisters shared an unbreakable bond that went beyond typical sibling relationships, their connection so strong that they seemed to communicate without words, finishing each other's sentences and sensing each other's moods with an accuracy that often amazed their mother. They moved through the world as a unit, Emma leading the way with her careful planning and protective instincts, Sofia bringing laughter and lightness to every situation, and Isabella observing everything with her wise eyes while offering quiet support when needed. Their grandmother often said they were like three parts of the same soul, each complete on her own, but somehow more powerful when together. That fatal Tuesday afternoon had begun like countless others, with Maria dropping the girls off at their grandmother's house before heading to her shift at the hospital. The summer sun blazed overhead, promising another scorching day where the only relief would come from the ancient air conditioning unit that wheezed and groaned in Carmen's living room window. The girls had eaten lunch together at the small kitchen table, Carmen serving them homemade tortillas with beans and rice while listening to their excited chatter about their plans for the afternoon. They wanted to play in the backyard, perhaps have a tea party under the old pepper tree, or create chalk drawings on the concrete patio. Carmen had given her permission, as she always did, with her standard warnings about staying within the fenced yard and coming inside if they needed anything. She settled into her favorite rocking chair on the front porch with her mending basket, positioning herself where she could keep an eye on the girls while they played and simultaneously watch for any neighbors who might stop by for a chat. The afternoon stretched ahead peacefully, filled with the familiar sounds of children's laughter and the gentle creaking of her rocking chair against the wooden porch boards. At approximately 2:15 p.m., according to Carmen's later testimony to police, she heard the girls discussing whether they should pick flowers from the side yard to make crowns for their tea party. Emma had suggested they ask permission first, her responsible nature evident even in play, while Sofia had argued that the flowers were already falling off the bushes and would just go to waste. Isabella had remained characteristically quiet during this debate, though Carmen remembered seeing her nod when Emma finally decided they should gather only the flowers that had already fallen to the ground. The last confirmed sighting of the three sisters alive came at 2:23 p.m., when Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor from across the street, waved to them from her own front porch as they skipped along the sidewalk outside Carmen's house. Mrs. Peterson later told investigators that the girls had seemed perfectly normal, holding hands in their usual formation with Emma in the middle, all three wearing the matching sundresses that Maria had bought them the previous weekend. They appeared to be heading toward the side of the house where Carmen's flower garden bloomed in brilliant profusion, their voices carrying clearly across the quiet street as they discussed their plans for the afternoon. Carmen dozed lightly in her rocking chair, lulled by the warmth of the afternoon sun and the peaceful sounds of the neighborhood settling into its daily rhythm. She later estimated that she had closed her eyes for no more than 20 minutes, maybe 30 at the most, her consciousness hovering in that drowsy state between waking and sleeping, where mothers and grandmothers often find themselves during quiet afternoons. When she fully awakened and called out to check on the girls, she was met with silence, a sudden and complete absence of the chatter and laughter that had filled the air just moments before. The initial search began immediately, with Carmen checking every room in the house, calling the girls' names with increasing urgency as she moved from the kitchen to the bedrooms to the basement. She searched the backyard thoroughly, looking behind every bush and tree, checking the small storage shed, where garden tools were kept, even peering into the old well that had been sealed decades earlier. The front yard yielded no clues, and a quick walk around the block while calling their names produced only concerned neighbors who joined the search effort. By 3:30 p.m., when the girls had been missing for over an hour, Carmen called Maria at the hospital, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what had happened. Maria left work immediately, racing through traffic with her heart pounding and her mind conjuring terrible scenarios. She arrived home to find Carmen surrounded by neighbors, everyone searching different areas of the property and calling the girls' names with voices that grew more desperate with each passing minute. The police were called at 3:47 p.m., and within minutes the quiet streets of Maplewood Heights were filled with patrol cars and emergency vehicles. Detective Sarah Chen, a 15-year veteran of the force with extensive experience in missing persons cases, took charge of the investigation, immediately establishing a command center in Carmen's living room and beginning the systematic process of interviewing witnesses and searching the area. The initial response was swift and professional, with officers canvassing the neighborhood door to door while search and rescue teams prepared to expand the search radius. What investigators discovered in those first crucial hours would set the tone for a case that would confound experts and consume resources for years to come. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no witnesses who had seen the girls leave the immediate area. The flowers they had planned to collect lay undisturbed beneath Carmen's roses, their tea party supplies still arranged hopefully on the patio table. It was as if 3 little girls had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a family desperate for answers. The Maplewood Heights Police Department had never encountered a case quite like the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance, and Detective Sarah Chen found herself staring at a puzzle with pieces that seemed to defy logical arrangement. At 42 years old, Chen had built her reputation on methodical investigation techniques and an intuitive understanding of human behavior that had helped her solve dozens of missing persons cases throughout her career. She possessed the rare combination of analytical precision and emotional intelligence that made her particularly effective when working with traumatized families. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, while simultaneously conveying genuine empathy, earning her the respect of colleagues and community members alike. Chen's partner, Detective Marcus Williams, brought a different but complementary skill set to the investigation. A former military police officer who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the civilian force, Williams understood the complexities of family dynamics under stress and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of investigative protocols that proved invaluable during the initial phases of complex cases. His background had taught him to look beyond the obvious, to question assumptions that others might accept without scrutiny, and to maintain objectivity even when emotions ran high and pressure mounted from media attention and community concern. The Rodriguez family's roots in Maplewood Heights ran deep, extending back 3 generations to when Carmen's late husband, Roberto, had purchased their small house on Elm Street, with savings accumulated during his 20-year career as a construction foreman. Roberto had passed away 5 years earlier from complications related to diabetes, leaving Carmen to navigate widowhood while maintaining the strong family bonds that had always been the cornerstone of their immigrant experience. His absence created a void that the entire family still felt keenly, particularly during times of crisis when his steady presence and practical wisdom would have provided comfort and guidance. Maria Rodriguez embodied the strength and resilience that had characterized her family for generations, working 16-hour days to support her daughters while her husband David served his country overseas. Her colleagues at Maplewood General Hospital described her as an exceptional nurse whose dedication to patient care never wavered despite the personal challenges she faced as a military spouse managing single parenthood. The overnight shifts she frequently worked allowed her to be present during her daughter's waking hours, a sacrifice that demonstrated her unwavering commitment to maintaining stability and normalcy in their lives, despite the disruption caused by David's deployment. David Rodriguez, stationed at a forward operating base in Syria with the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, received notification of his daughter's disappearance through official military channels. The news delivered by his commanding officer in the sterile environment of a base communications facility thousands of miles from home. The Marine Corps immediately began processing emergency leave paperwork that would allow David to return to California. But the logistics of military transportation meant he would not arrive for at least 48 hours, leaving him to endure the agonizing wait while receiving updates through sporadic satellite phone calls that provided little comfort and no concrete information about his daughter's whereabouts. The community of Maplewood Heights mobilized with remarkable speed and organization, demonstrating the tight-knit bonds that characterized this suburban enclave, where neighbors still knew each other's names and children played freely in yards, protected by generations of mutual trust and vigilance. Within hours of the girl's disappearance, search teams had formed spontaneously, with residents organizing themselves into grid patterns to systematically cover every inch of the surrounding area. Local businesses donated food and supplies to sustain the search effort, while churches opened their doors to provide coordination centers and comfort for the increasingly desperate family members. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, the 78-year-old neighbor who had provided the last confirmed sighting of the sisters, became a crucial witness whose testimony would be scrutinized repeatedly as the investigation progressed. A retired elementary school teacher who had lived on Elm Street for over 30 years, Mrs. Peterson possessed the observational skills and attention to detail that made her account particularly valuable to investigators. She had known the Rodriguez family since Maria was a teenager, watching Emma, Sofia, and Isabella grow from babies into the vibrant children who brightened the entire neighborhood with their presence and energy. The physical landscape of Maplewood Heights presented both advantages and challenges for the search effort, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained properties providing numerous hiding places, while simultaneously limiting potential escape routes for anyone attempting to leave the area undetected. The neighborhood sat on a gentle hillside overlooking the Sacramento Valley, its elevated position offering clear sightlines in multiple directions, while the surrounding terrain featured hiking trails, creek beds, and patches of undeveloped land that would require extensive searching by trained personnel and specialized equipment. Search and Rescue Coordinator Lieutenant James Morrison brought 23 years of experience to the case, having supervised hundreds of missing persons investigations throughout Northern California's diverse geographical regions. His team included trained volunteers, K-9 units, helicopter crews, and specialized personnel equipped with thermal imaging technology capable of detecting human presence even in challenging environmental conditions. Morrison's systematic approach to large-scale searches had resulted in successful recoveries in cases where other methods had failed, earning him recognition as one of the state's leading experts in missing persons recovery operations. The initial search radius encompassed a 2-mile area surrounding Carmen's house, based on statistical analysis of similar cases involving missing children and the maximum distance 3 young girls could reasonably travel on foot within the established timeline. Teams methodically examined every structure, vehicle, and natural feature within this perimeter, including abandoned buildings, construction sites, storm drains, and the network of irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the agricultural areas adjacent to the residential neighborhood. The thoroughness of this initial search would later prove significant, as investigators struggled to understand how 3 children could vanish so completely from such a well-defined geographic area. Local media attention intensified rapidly as news of the disappearance spread throughout the region, with television crews and newspaper reporters converging on Maplewood Heights to document the unfolding drama. Channel 7 news anchor Jennifer Walsh, whose own daughter attended the same elementary school as Emma Rodriguez, provided particularly sensitive coverage that focused on the community's response rather than sensationalizing the family's tragedy. The media presence brought both benefits and complications, generating widespread public awareness that led to hundreds of tips and potential sightings, while simultaneously creating additional stress for a family already overwhelmed by grief and uncertainty. The FBI's involvement began on the second day when local authorities requested federal assistance based on the possibility that the girls had been transported across state lines. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in crimes against children, established a federal task force that brought additional resources and expertise to the investigation, while maintaining collaborative relationships with local law enforcement agencies. Agent Torres had successfully resolved similar cases throughout her 12-year career, though she privately acknowledged that the complete absence of physical evidence and credible witnesses made the Rodriguez case uniquely challenging. Carmen Rodriguez emerged as a pillar of strength despite her overwhelming guilt and anxiety, opening her home to investigators and volunteers while maintaining the routines that kept hope alive in the face of mounting despair. She continued cooking meals for the search teams, her kitchen becoming an informal command center where information was shared and strategies discussed over cups of strong coffee and plates of homemade tamales. Her faith sustained her through the darkest moments, leading prayer circles that brought together community members from different religious traditions united in their concern for 3 innocent children and their devastated family. The girls. Elementary school, Maplewood Heights Primary, became another focal point for community support, as teachers, administrators, and parents struggled to process the disappearance of students who had been integral parts of their educational family. Principal Margaret Foster organized counseling services for children traumatized by their classmates' disappearance, while coordinating with investigators who needed to interview teachers and staff members for any information that might prove relevant to the case. The school's grief counselors worked overtime to help young minds process concepts of loss and uncertainty that challenged even adult understanding. Emma's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Sullivan, provided investigators with detailed character assessments that painted a picture of a responsible, intelligent child who would never willingly put herself or her sisters in danger. She described Emma as a natural leader who consistently demonstrated mature judgment in challenging situations, making her disappearance even more puzzling since it seemed completely inconsistent with her established behavioral patterns. Mrs. Sullivan's observations would later prove significant as investigators attempted to reconstruct the events leading up to the sisters' vanishing and understand the psychology behind their apparent decision to leave their grandmother's property. Sofia's kindergarten teacher, Mr. Michael Rodriguez, no relation to the family, emphasized the youngest girl's intuitive social skills and her ability to sense danger or discomfort in various situations. His professional assessment suggested that Sofia would have resisted any attempt by strangers to lure her away from familiar surroundings, particularly without her older sister's approval and guidance. This psychological profile added another layer of complexity to an investigation already struggling with the absence of conventional evidence or logical explanations for the girl's disappearance. The investigation's scope expanded daily as new leads emerged from the community's intensive search efforts and the growing media coverage that reached audiences throughout California and beyond. Tips poured in from across the country, with well-meaning citizens reporting sightings that ranged from credible to completely implausible, each requiring careful evaluation and follow-up investigation that stretched departmental resources to their limits. Detective Chen found herself coordinating multiple simultaneous investigations while maintaining focus on the core evidence and refusing to be distracted by the numerous false leads that inevitably accompanied high-profile missing persons cases. Part 3. The Antagonist Introduction. The systematic investigation into the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance began to reveal unsettling patterns that Detective Chen had hoped never to encounter in the peaceful community of Maplewood Heights. As the search entered its 3rd day without any credible leads or physical evidence, investigators found themselves confronting the possibility that the girl's vanishing might not have been accidental or the result of childhood wandering gone wrong. The statistical reality of missing children cases suggested darker possibilities that Chen had learned to consider, even when families and communities desperately clung to more innocent explanations for unexplained disappearances. During routine background checks conducted on all adults with access to the neighborhood, investigators uncovered information about Harold Vance, a registered sex offender who had been quietly living in a converted garage apartment just 4 blocks from the Rodriguez family home. Vance, a pale, thin man in his mid-50s with prematurely graying hair and nervous mannerisms, had completed his parole requirements 18 months earlier, but remained subject to routine monitoring by local law enforcement agencies. His criminal history included 2 convictions for inappropriate contact with minors, crimes that had occurred in different counties over a span of 12 years before his relocation to Maplewood Heights. Vance worked sporadically as a maintenance contractor for various property management companies throughout the region, a job that provided him with legitimate reasons to be present in residential neighborhoods during daytime hours when children might be playing outside without close adult supervision. His van, a faded blue Ford Transit with magnetic signs advertising reliable repairs and maintenance, had become a familiar sight throughout Maplewood Heights, as he serviced rental properties and performed odd jobs for elderly homeowners who appreciated his reasonable rates and quiet demeanor. The vehicle's ubiquitous presence in the neighborhood meant that residents had grown accustomed to seeing it parked on various streets, making it virtually invisible despite its potential significance to the ongoing investigation. Detective Williams conducted the initial interview with Vance at his cramped apartment, a space that immediately struck the experienced investigator as uncomfortably sterile and devoid of personal touches that might indicate normal social connections or hobbies. The walls were bare except for a single calendar displaying nature photographs, and the furniture consisted of mismatched pieces that suggested frequent relocations and minimal investment in creating a comfortable living environment. Vance answered questions with carefully measured responses that demonstrated familiarity with police interrogation techniques, his answers technically truthful, but lacking the spontaneous details that typically characterized innocent witnesses, eager to assist ongoing investigations. When asked about his whereabouts on the afternoon of the sisters' disappearance, Vance produced a work order indicating that he had been scheduled to repair a leaking faucet at a rental property on Maple Avenue, approximately 8 blocks from the Rodriguez home. The timing of this appointment, which allegedly began at 2 p.m. and concluded around 4:30 p.m., would have placed him in the general vicinity during the crucial window when the girls vanished. However, the property owner who had requested the repair work was traveling out of state and could not immediately confirm whether Vance had actually completed the scheduled maintenance or had been present at the property during the specified time frame. Vance's behavior during the interview raised additional concerns for Detective Williams, who had developed expertise in reading body language and verbal cues during his military police training and subsequent civilian law enforcement career. The suspect maintained unnaturally rigid posture throughout the questioning, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and his eyes rarely making direct contact with the interviewing officer. When questions touched on his knowledge of the Rodriguez family or his awareness of the children who lived in the neighborhood, Vance's responses became even more stilted and mechanical, suggesting rehearsed answers rather than genuine recollections of casual neighborhood interactions. Further investigation into Vance's background revealed a pattern of residential instability that had characterized his adult life since his initial conviction 15 years earlier. He had lived in 17 different locations across 4 counties, typically remaining in each place for 12 to 18 months before relocating under circumstances that were not always clearly documented in official records. Former neighbors in several of these locations, when contacted by investigators, described him as a quiet, solitary individual who avoided social interactions and seemed to prefer environments where he could observe others without being observed himself. The maintenance company that occasionally employed Vance provided additional concerning information about his work patterns and professional behavior. Supervisor Tom Bradley, who had hired Vance for seasonal contract work over the past 2 years, noted that the man always insisted on working alone and showed particular interest in assignments that involved residential properties where families with children lived. Bradley had initially attributed this preference to Vance's claim that he worked more efficiently without supervision, but retrospective analysis of his work assignments revealed a disturbing correlation between the locations he requested and neighborhoods with high concentrations of young families. Vance's criminal history files, obtained through interagency cooperation with probation departments in adjacent counties, painted a picture of escalating boldness in his interactions with potential victims. His first conviction had involved inappropriate touching of a neighbor's daughter during what appeared to be a chance encounter at a community playground. The second incident, which occurred 6 years later in a different county, demonstrated more sophisticated planning and manipulation, as Vance had volunteered to help a single mother with yard work, specifically to gain access to her 8-year-old daughter when the child was home from school. Psychological evaluations, conducted during Vance's previous incarcerations, indicated that he possessed above-average intelligence and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of law enforcement investigative techniques, knowledge that he had apparently acquired through extensive research and interaction with other offenders during his prison sentences. These assessments suggested that any future criminal activity would likely involve careful planning and deliberate efforts to avoid detection, characteristics that aligned disturbingly well with the complete absence of evidence surrounding the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance. Detective Chen's team expanded their surveillance of Vance while simultaneously investigating his potential connections to other unsolved missing persons cases in the region. Database searches revealed 3 additional cases involving missing children within a 50-mile radius of locations where Vance had previously lived, though the timeframes and circumstances varied enough to make definitive connections difficult to establish without additional evidence. The possibility that the Rodriguez sisters might not represent Vance's first successful abduction added urgency to the investigation, while highlighting the potential scope of crimes that might have gone undetected for years. The suspect's financial records revealed another disturbing pattern that suggested possible involvement in activities related to child exploitation. Despite earning modest wages through his sporadic maintenance work, Vance had made regular cash deposits to his bank account in amounts that seemed inconsistent with his declared income sources. When questioned about these deposits during a follow-up interview, he claimed they represented payment for private handyman services performed for elderly neighbors who preferred to pay in cash, but he could not provide specific names or contact information for these alleged clients. Vance's internet usage history, obtained through search warrants executed on his computer equipment and cellular phone, revealed extensive research into missing children cases throughout California and neighboring states. His browser history included hundreds of visits to news websites covering abduction cases, law enforcement websites detailing investigative techniques, and forums where individuals discussed strategies for avoiding detection during criminal activities. While this research could potentially be explained as morbid curiosity rather than criminal planning, the volume and specificity of his online activities suggested a level of obsession that extended far beyond casual interest in true crime stories. The physical evidence collected from Vance's apartment and vehicle proved frustratingly inconclusive, despite exhaustive forensic examination by specialized technicians who had successfully processed evidence in numerous previous cases involving crimes against children. The apartment yielded no obvious traces of the missing girls, though investigators noted that the space had been recently cleaned with industrial-strength chemicals that could have eliminated biological evidence such as hair, fibers, or DNA traces. Similarly, his van showed signs of recent interior detailing that included steam cleaning of upholstery and complete replacement of floor mats, improvements that Vance claimed were necessary maintenance rather than evidence destruction. Polygraph examinations administered by certified specialists produced ambiguous results that suggested deception, but did not meet the threshold for definitive conclusions about Vance's involvement in the sisters' disappearance. His physiological responses to control questions indicated that he was experiencing significant stress during the examination process, but this anxiety could be attributed to his previous negative experiences with law enforcement rather than guilt about specific criminal activities. The polygraph examiner noted that subjects with extensive criminal histories often display heightened stress responses that can complicate interpretation of test results, making the examination less useful as an investigative tool. Community members who lived near Vance's apartment began reporting their own unsettling observations about his behavior in the weeks leading up to the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance. Several neighbors recalled seeing him sitting in his parked van for extended periods while appearing to watch children walking home from school or playing in nearby yards. Mrs. Adelaide Thompson, whose apartment window overlooked the small parking area where Vance kept his vehicle, reported that she had observed him cleaning the van's interior with unusual thoroughness on the evening after the girls vanished. working by flashlight well past midnight despite the availability of overhead lighting in the parking area. The investigation into Vance's activities expanded to include examination of his cellular phone records, which revealed a pattern of movement throughout Maplewood Heights that corresponded with school dismissal times and playground usage schedules. GPS data indicated that he had been in the vicinity of the Rodriguez home on multiple occasions during the month preceding the disappearance, though his presence could potentially be explained by legitimate maintenance work in the general neighborhood. However, the frequency and timing of these visits suggested a level of familiarity with local routines that extended beyond what would be necessary for his professional responsibilities. As investigators delved deeper into Vance's background and potential connections to the missing sisters, they discovered that his carefully constructed facade of compliance and rehabilitation masked a sophisticated understanding of how to operate within the system while continuing to pursue his criminal interests. His ability to maintain employment, satisfy parole requirements, and avoid suspicious behavior during routine check-ins demonstrated the calculating intelligence that made him particularly dangerous and difficult to apprehend. The Rodriguez case represented exactly the type of challenge that Vance seemed to have been preparing for throughout his adult criminal career, a test of his ability to execute a complex crime while avoiding the investigative techniques that had led to his previous convictions. Detective Chen's decision to bring Harold Vance in for formal questioning represented a calculated escalation in the investigation, driven by mounting circumstantial evidence and the urgent need to either eliminate him as a suspect or develop concrete leads before the trail grew completely cold. The interview room at Maplewood Heights Police Department had witnessed countless interrogations over the years, but few cases had carried the emotional weight and community pressure surrounding the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance. Chen understood that this confrontation might represent their best opportunity to break through Vance's carefully constructed defenses and uncover the truth about what had happened to 3 innocent children. Vance arrived at the station accompanied by his court-appointed attorney, Margaret Ellis, a seasoned defense lawyer who specialized in representing clients with histories of sexual offenses and understood the complex legal landscape surrounding such cases. Ellis had reviewed Vance's file thoroughly and recognized that her client's previous convictions made him an obvious target for investigators desperate to solve a high-profile missing persons case. Her presence signaled that Vance understood the seriousness of his situation and had no intention of cooperating with law enforcement beyond what was legally required, a stance that immediately increased tensions in what Detective Chen had hoped might be a more collaborative interview. The formal interrogation began at 10:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the sisters had vanished from their grandmother's front yard. Chen opened with routine questions designed to establish baseline responses, while simultaneously assessing Vance's demeanor and willingness to provide detailed information about his activities and whereabouts. His answers remained consistent with previous statements, delivered in the same measured tone that had characterized all his interactions with law enforcement. But Chen detected subtle changes in his body language that suggested increased anxiety about the direction of the questioning. When Chen presented evidence of Vance's presence in the neighborhood during the time period when the girls disappeared, including GPS data from his cellular phone and witness statements about his van being seen on nearby streets, his responses became noticeably more defensive and less forthcoming. He insisted that his work required him to travel throughout the area and that his presence near the Rodriguez home was entirely coincidental, related to legitimate maintenance activities that could be verified through his employment records. However, when pressed for specific details about the work he had allegedly performed on the day in question, Vance's recollections became vague and inconsistent. Detective Williams joined the interrogation after an hour, bringing with him a detailed timeline of Vance's known movements and activities that had been reconstructed through painstaking analysis of available evidence. The timeline revealed several unexplained gaps in Vance's whereabouts, including a crucial 90-minute period during the afternoon when his phone had been turned off and his vehicle's location could not be determined through available tracking methods. Williams pressed Vance to account for this missing time, but the suspect claimed he could not remember exactly where he had been or what he had been doing during those specific hours. The confrontation intensified when Chen introduced photographs of the Rodriguez sisters, placing the images directly in front of Vance while carefully observing his reactions. For the first time during the interview, his composure appeared to crack slightly, his eyes lingering on Emma's school photograph for several seconds before he quickly looked away and claimed he had never seen the children before, despite living within walking distance of their grandmother's house. His attorney immediately intervened, advising her client not to respond to questions that seemed designed to elicit emotional reactions rather than factual information about his whereabouts and activities. Chen shifted tactics, presenting evidence of Vance's internet search history and his extensive research into missing children cases throughout the region. When confronted with browser logs showing hundreds of visits to websites covering abduction cases and law enforcement investigative techniques, Vance initially claimed the searches were related to his general interest in true crime stories. However, when Williams pointed out that his research had focused specifically on cases involving young children and had intensified significantly in the months leading up to the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance, Vance fell silent and refused to provide any explanation for this pattern of online activity. The interrogation room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as investigators presented additional circumstantial evidence linking Vance to the missing girls. Security camera footage from a gas station near the Rodriguez neighborhood showed his van refueling at 1:47 p.m. on the day of the disappearance, placing him in the immediate area during the critical time window. When asked why he had purchased gasoline in that specific location when there were several stations closer to his apartment and his alleged work site, Vance claimed he could not remember his reasoning and suggested that he might have simply chosen the station with the lowest posted prices. Chen's questioning became more direct and aggressive as she presented evidence that contradicted Vance's previous statements about his activities and whereabouts. Phone records indicated that he had made no calls and sent no text messages during the crucial afternoon hours, an unusual communication pattern for someone who claimed to have been working and needed to coordinate with clients and supervisors. When confronted with this inconsistency, Vance insisted that he often worked for extended periods without using his phone, though his typical communication patterns on other workdays showed frequent contact with various parties throughout his shifts. The psychological pressure of the interrogation began to affect Vance's carefully maintained facade as investigators systematically dismantled his alibi and exposed inconsistencies in his statements. His hands began to tremble slightly as he reached for the water glass that Chen had provided, and beads of perspiration appeared on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned comfort of the interview room. Attorney Ellis called for several brief breaks during which she consulted privately with her client, each conference resulting in even more guarded responses and increased reluctance to provide any information beyond basic confirmations of previously established facts. Williams introduced evidence of Vance's financial irregularities, including the unexplained cash deposits that had appeared in his bank account with increasing frequency over the past year. When pressed to identify the sources of this additional income, Vance's explanations became increasingly implausible and contradictory. He claimed the money came from various odd jobs performed for elderly neighbors, but could not provide names, addresses, or contact information for any of these alleged clients. The amounts and timing of the deposits suggested systematic rather than sporadic income, contradicting his characterization of the work as occasional favors for grateful neighbors. The confrontation reached a crucial turning point when Chen presented evidence of Vance's prior surveillance activities, including witness statements from neighbors who had observed him watching children in the area and taking photographs with a telephoto lens from his parked van. When shown copies of photographs found on his personal computer that depicted children playing in various neighborhood locations, including several images that appeared to have been taken near the Rodriguez home, Vance claimed he was an amateur photographer interested in documenting community life and family activities. Ellis recognized that her client's position was becoming increasingly untenable as investigators presented wave after wave of circumstantial evidence that suggested his involvement in activities directly related to the missing sisters. She attempted to redirect the questioning toward procedural matters and challenge the admissibility of various pieces of evidence, but Chen and Williams maintained their focused pressure while staying within established legal boundaries that protected the integrity of their investigation and any potential prosecution that might result from their findings. The formal interrogation session extended through the afternoon as investigators systematically addressed every aspect of Vance's alibi and challenged his explanations for the mounting evidence that connected him to the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance. Despite the psychological pressure and the overwhelming circumstantial case being built against him, Vance maintained his claims of innocence while providing increasingly unconvincing explanations for his activities and whereabouts during the crucial time period. His attorney's frequent interventions and advice to remain silent on specific questions made it clear that they understood the serious legal jeopardy he was facing. As evening approached and the interrogation entered its 8th hour, Chen made a final attempt to break through Vance's defenses by appealing to whatever humanity might exist beneath his carefully constructed persona. She spoke directly about the Rodriguez family's anguish and the community's desperate need for answers about what had happened to 3 innocent children who had simply wanted to play in their grandmother's yard on a summer afternoon. For a moment, Vance's composure seemed to waver, his eyes reflecting what might have been genuine emotion or merely calculated manipulation designed to generate sympathy and reduce suspicion. The confrontation concluded without a confession or definitive breakthrough, leaving investigators with substantial circumstantial evidence, but lacking the concrete proof needed to file formal charges or obtain search warrants for more invasive investigative techniques. Vance was released pending further investigation, though he remained under continuous surveillance as detectives continued building their case and searching for the definitive evidence that would either prove his guilt or eliminate him as a suspect. The initial confrontation had revealed the sophisticated nature of his criminal thinking and his determination to avoid accountability, setting the stage for a prolonged investigation that would test every resource and technique available to law enforcement agencies committed to finding the truth about the Rodriguez sisters' fate. The release of Harold Vance from police custody sent shockwaves through the Maplewood Heights community, where residents had been following every development in the Rodriguez sisters' case with growing anxiety and desperate hope for resolution. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence that investigators had presented during the 8-hour interrogation, the legal system's requirement for concrete proof meant that Vance walked out of the police station as a free man, able to return to his daily routines while 3 young girls remained missing, and their family endured another sleepless night filled with unanswered questions and diminishing hope for their safe return. Detective Chen watched from her office window as Vance climbed into his attorney's sedan, his movements deliberately casual as if to demonstrate his lack of concern about the investigation or its potential consequences. The sight filled her with professional frustration and personal anguish, knowing that substantial evidence pointed toward his involvement, while legal constraints prevented more aggressive investigative actions that might finally uncover the truth about what had happened during those crucial 47 minutes when Emma, Sofia, and Isabella had vanished from their grandmother's front yard. Within hours of Vance's release, disturbing reports began filtering back to investigators through the surveillance teams that had been assigned to monitor his activities around the clock. Rather than maintaining a low profile or showing any signs of remorse or anxiety about his situation, Vance appeared to be deliberately taunting law enforcement by visiting locations throughout Maplewood Heights that held significance to the ongoing investigation. His first stop after leaving the police station was a gas station just 2 blocks from the Rodriguez family home, where he purchased cigarettes and a newspaper while engaging in casual conversation with the clerk about the media coverage of the missing children case. The surveillance team reported that Vance had driven slowly past Carmen Rodriguez's house 3 times during the evening hours, his van moving at speeds well below the posted limit while he appeared to observe the continuing search activities, and the memorial flowers that community members had placed along the fence, where the girls had last been seen. His brazen behavior suggested either complete confidence in his ability to avoid prosecution or a psychological compulsion to revisit the scene of his alleged crimes, both possibilities that deeply concerned investigators who recognized the patterns of behavior associated with serial offenders who derived satisfaction from observing the aftermath of their criminal activities. Social media platforms exploded with outrage and speculation as news of Vance's release spread throughout the community and beyond, with residents expressing fury at what they perceived as law enforcement's failure to protect their children from a known predator who remained free despite overwhelming evidence of his suspicious behavior. Facebook groups dedicated to finding the Rodriguez sisters became forums for increasingly heated discussions about vigilante justice and citizen action, with some community members organizing informal patrols to monitor Vance's movements and others calling for more direct confrontation with someone they viewed as clearly responsible for the girls' disappearance. Maria Rodriguez collapsed from exhaustion and emotional strain during a press conference intended to appeal for continued public assistance in finding her daughters. Her breakdown captured by television cameras and broadcast repeatedly on local news programs that seemed more interested in dramatic footage than respectful coverage of a family's ongoing tragedy. The image of a devastated mother being carried away by paramedics while her elderly mother-in-law wept openly became a symbol of the investigation's failure to provide justice or resolution, further inflaming community anger toward both Vance and the legal system that had allowed his release. Anonymous threats against Vance began appearing on various online platforms, with posts containing specific details about his address, daily routines, and employment activities that suggested surveillance by private citizens who had taken the investigation into their own hands. The threatening messages ranged from promises of financial reward for information about his criminal activities to explicit descriptions of violence that would be inflicted upon him if he did not confess to his alleged crimes and reveal the location where the Rodriguez sisters were being held or had been killed. Detective Williams received multiple reports from concerned citizens who claimed to have witnessed Vance engaging in suspicious behavior near schools, playgrounds, and residential areas where children congregated during afternoon and evening hours. While many of these reports proved to be based on misidentification or exaggerated interpretations of innocent activities, several witnesses provided credible accounts of Vance photographing children from his van or approaching young people with offers of candy or assistance that seemed designed to establish inappropriate contact. The psychological evaluation that had been court-ordered during Vance's previous conviction revealed additional disturbing information that investigators had not fully appreciated during their initial assessment of his criminal history. The prison psychologist's report described him as exhibiting narcissistic personality traits combined with sophisticated manipulation skills that made him particularly dangerous to vulnerable populations, especially children who might be impressed by adult attention and authority. The evaluation specifically warned that Vance was likely to escalate his criminal behavior over time and would probably develop more sophisticated methods for avoiding detection based on his experiences with law enforcement. Carmen Rodriguez's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress of her granddaughter's disappearance and the knowledge that their suspected abductor remained free to continue his activities throughout their neighborhood. She began experiencing panic attacks whenever she saw vehicles similar to Vance's van, and her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels that required emergency medical intervention and ongoing pharmaceutical management. The woman who had been the emotional anchor for her family and community found herself unable to leave her house or maintain the daily routines that had previously provided structure and purpose to her life. Local news investigations revealed that Vance had been the subject of complaints and suspicious activity reports in 3 other communities where he had previously lived, but interagency communication failures had prevented comprehensive background checks that might have identified him as a high-risk individual when he relocated to Maplewood Heights. The bureaucratic failures that had allowed a repeat offender to establish himself in a family-oriented community without appropriate monitoring or community notification sparked additional outrage and demands for systemic reforms in how law enforcement agencies track and supervise convicted sex offenders. The Rodriguez family's attorney, Patricia Morales, who had been retained to ensure their interests were protected during the investigation, publicly criticized the district attorney's office for what she characterized as a weak and ineffective response to overwhelming evidence of Vance's guilt. Morales held a press conference where she detailed the circumstantial evidence that investigators had compiled, arguing that the legal standard for arrest and detention was being applied too conservatively given the serious nature of the crimes and the ongoing threat that Vance posed to community safety. School districts throughout the region implemented emergency safety protocols in response to community pressure and parental demands for increased protection of students during school hours and extracurricular activities. The measures included mandatory background checks for all volunteer coaches and activity supervisors, enhanced security cameras in parking areas and playgrounds, and revised dismissal procedures that required verified adult authorization before children could be released from school supervision. While these changes addressed legitimate safety concerns, they also served as constant reminders of the threat that remained present while Vance continued his normal activities. Anonymous tips to the police department's hotline increased dramatically following Vance's release, with callers reporting sightings and suspicious activities that kept investigators busy, following leads that rarely produced actionable intelligence. The volume of calls overwhelmed departmental resources and made it difficult to distinguish between credible information and speculation based on community fears and anger. Several tips led to dramatic responses by law enforcement teams who surrounded innocent individuals whose only crime was resembling Vance or driving similar vehicles in areas where concerned citizens expected to see suspicious activity. Vance's employment situation became increasingly precarious as property management companies and individual clients became aware of his status as the primary suspect in the Rodriguez sisters' disappearance. While he had not been formally charged with any crimes, the negative publicity and community hostility made it impossible for him to continue working in residential areas where his presence generated immediate calls to police and confrontations with angry residents who recognized him from television news coverage. The loss of employment income forced him to rely increasingly on the mysterious cash sources that investigators had been unable to fully explain or verify. The failure of the legal system to hold Vance accountable despite substantial evidence of his involvement created a dangerous atmosphere of community vigilantism that law enforcement officials struggled to control without appearing to protect a suspected child predator from justified public anger. Several incidents occurred where citizens followed Vance's van and confronted him in public places, creating potential safety hazards and compromising the official surveillance operations that were attempting to gather additional evidence of his criminal activities. The delicate balance between maintaining public order and respecting constitutional protections became increasingly difficult to maintain as community frustration reached dangerous levels. Media coverage of the case began focusing more heavily on the apparent failures of law enforcement and the legal system rather than the continuing search for the missing girls, creating additional pressure on investigators who found themselves defending their methods and decisions rather than concentrating on finding Emma, Sofia, and Isabella. The shift in media narrative reflected growing public skepticism about whether justice would ever be achieved and whether the Rodriguez family would ever learn the truth about what had happened to their beloved daughters and granddaughters during those fateful minutes when 3 innocent children had trusted the wrong person and paid an unimaginable price for that moment of childhood vulnerability. 3 weeks had passed since Emma, Sofia, and Isabella Rodriguez had vanished from their grandmother's front yard, and the investigation had reached a devastating standstill that left their family drowning in despair and the entire community grappling with the horrifying possibility that 3 innocent children might never come home. Detective Chen stared at the evidence board in the task force command center, surrounded by photographs, timelines, and investigative reports that told a story of systematic failure, despite the tireless efforts of dozens of law enforcement professionals who had worked around the clock to solve the most heartbreaking case of their careers. Harold Vance continued his daily routines with an arrogance that seemed to mock the investigation and the suffering of the Rodriguez family, his movements monitored constantly by surveillance teams who had documented his every activity, but had been unable to gather the concrete evidence needed to justify an arrest warrant or search of his premises. The legal constraints that protected his constitutional rights had become a shield behind which he operated with apparent impunity, visiting grocery stores, restaurants, and public spaces throughout Maplewood Heights while 3 young girls remained missing and their fate unknown to everyone except possibly the man who seemed to derive satisfaction from the community's anguish and frustration. Maria Rodriguez had been hospitalized twice during the past week, her physical and emotional collapse requiring medical intervention, as her body finally succumbed to the relentless stress of not knowing whether her daughters were alive or dead, suffering or beyond pain, crying for their mother or silenced forever by unspeakable violence. The woman who had been a pillar of strength for her patients at the hospital now lay sedated in a psychiatric ward, her mind unable to process the reality of a world where her children could simply disappear without explanation or consequence. For the person everyone believed was responsible for their fate, David Rodriguez had returned from his deployment in Syria, only to find himself trapped in a different kind of war zone, where the enemy remained invisible, and the rules of engagement were dictated by legal procedures that seemed designed to protect the guilty rather than find justice for the innocent. The Marine who had faced combat situations with courage and determination found himself powerless against a bureaucratic system that prioritized process over results, constitutional protections over common sense, and procedural safeguards over the desperate need to locate 3 missing children before it became too late to save them. Carmen Rodriguez had aged a decade in 3 weeks, her faith shaken to its core by the apparent triumph of evil over good, her prayers unanswered despite the countless hours she had spent on her knees begging God to return her granddaughters to their family's loving embrace. The woman who had been the spiritual foundation for her community now questioned everything she had believed about divine justice and protective providence, wondering how a merciful creator could allow innocent children to suffer while their tormentor walked free and unpunished through the same neighborhood where they had played and laughed just weeks earlier. The FBI task force had expanded to include behavioral analysts, child recovery specialists, and technical experts from multiple agencies. But their sophisticated investigative techniques had failed to produce the breakthrough that everyone desperately needed to transform suspicion into proof and speculation into conviction. Agent Torres found herself explaining to increasingly hostile community members why federal resources and expertise had been unable to solve a case that seemed obvious to everyone who had followed the evidence and witnessed Vance's behavior throughout the investigation. Search teams had expanded their efforts to cover hundreds of square miles throughout Northern California, utilizing helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology, cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains, and volunteer groups who had sacrificed their own time and resources to look for any trace of the missing sisters. The massive effort had consumed enormous resources and generated thousands of tips from well-meaning citizens. But after 3 weeks of intensive searching, investigators had found no physical evidence that the girls had ever left the immediate vicinity of their grandmother's house. Media coverage of the case had evolved from sympathetic reporting about a family's tragedy into critical analysis of law enforcement failures and systemic problems that allowed suspected criminals to avoid accountability, despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence of their guilt. Television reporters and newspaper journalists had begun questioning whether the Rodriguez sisters represented victims of bureaucratic incompetence as much as criminal violence, their disappearance becoming a symbol of everything wrong, with a legal system that seemed more concerned with protecting the rights of the accused than finding justice for the innocent. Community vigilante groups had formed spontaneously throughout Maplewood Heights, with residents organizing patrol schedules and communication networks designed to monitor Vance's activities and document any behavior that might provide additional evidence of his involvement in the sisters' disappearance. While law enforcement officials discouraged these amateur surveillance efforts, they privately acknowledged that citizen involvement had become necessary given the limitations imposed by legal constraints and departmental resources that had proven insufficient to solve the case through conventional investigative methods. The psychological pressure on investigators had reached critical levels as they faced daily reminders of their apparent failure to protect 3 innocent children from a predator who remained free to continue his activities throughout their community. Detective Chen had requested reassignment to different cases twice during the past week, her professional confidence shattered by the inability to transform obvious guilt into legal proof, while Detective Williams had begun drinking heavily after his shifts, unable to reconcile his military training and decisive action with civilian law enforcement's requirement for patience and procedural compliance. Anonymous death threats against Vance had escalated to include specific plans for kidnapping, torture, and execution that local police took seriously enough to increase his protective surveillance, creating the paradoxical situation where law enforcement resources were being used to protect a suspected child killer from community members who had lost faith in the legal system's ability to deliver justice. The irony of protecting someone who might have murdered 3 children was not lost on officers who had joined law enforcement to serve and protect innocent people rather than shield criminals from the consequences of their actions. Harold Vance's behavior had become increasingly brazen and provocative, with surveillance teams reporting that he had begun photographing the memorial flowers and teddy bears that community members had placed near the Rodriguez home, his actions suggesting either complete confidence in his ability to avoid prosecution or psychological compulsion to document his success in evading accountability for his alleged crimes. His attorney had advised him to maintain a lower profile, but Vance seemed incapable of resisting opportunities to demonstrate his immunity from consequences and his power over a community that suspected but could not prove his guilt. The Rodriguez family's extended relatives had begun arriving from throughout California and Mexico, their presence transforming Carmen's small house into a crowded sanctuary where grief and hope battled for dominance while family members struggled to provide comfort for losses that might not be final and suffering that showed no signs of ending. The cultural traditions that typically provided structure and meaning during times of crisis seemed inadequate to address the unique horror of not knowing whether loved ones were alive or dead, present or absent, suffering or at peace. Local churches had organized continuous prayer vigils that brought together congregations from different denominations and ethnic backgrounds, their unified supplications representing the community's last hope that divine intervention might succeed where human efforts had failed. The ecumenical cooperation that emerged from shared tragedy provided some comfort to believers, but even the most faithful struggled to understand how their prayers could remain unanswered, while evil apparently triumphed over innocence and justice, remained elusive despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Dr. Patricia Chen, the police department's consulting psychologist, had begun working with investigators to help them cope with the emotional toll of the case and maintain their professional effectiveness despite the mounting pressure and apparent futility of their efforts. Her sessions revealed that many officers were questioning their career choices and wondering whether their commitment to protecting and serving had any meaning in a system that seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate the apprehension of dangerous criminals who threatened community safety. The case had attracted national attention from advocacy groups that focused on missing children and victims' rights, their involvement bringing additional resources and expertise while simultaneously increasing pressure on local law enforcement agencies to produce results that had thus far remained elusive. Representatives from these organizations had met with the Rodriguez family to offer support and assistance, but their well-intentioned efforts only served to highlight the apparent hopelessness of a situation where 3 young girls had simply vanished without trace or explanation. As the investigation entered its 4th week without resolution, even the most optimistic participants began acknowledging that the case might never be solved, that Harold Vance might escape accountability for his suspected crimes, and that Emma, Sofia, and Isabella Rodriguez might become another statistic in the tragic catalog of missing children whose fates remained unknown and whose families never received the closure that justice was supposed to provide. The possibility that evil might triumph over good that innocence might suffer while guilt went unpunished, and that 3 beautiful children might disappear forever without consequence for their alleged killer, represented the darkest moment in Maplewood Heights history and a test of faith that many residents feared they might fail. But sometimes, in the depths of despair, when hope seems lost and justice appears impossible, unexpected heroes emerge from the shadows to change everything. What happened next would transform this story of apparent defeat into something extraordinary, proving that truth has a way of surfacing even when those in power seem incapable of finding it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of justice, hope, and the extraordinary people who refuse to let evil triumph over good.